would like to thank the panelists here. We've got a great group of different points of view, and I'm hoping that we can have a really great conversation about what has become a really big buzzword in the defense community, multi-domain operations. I kind of hate it, not gonna lie. I think it's become talked about so much that we're a little bit losing sight of what it actually means and why it's important. So as I ask each of the panelists to start off, their opening remarks, I'm hoping that, each of you guys, could you kind of touch on how you see the problem of multi-domain operations? Like what is the problem here that needs to be solved? Starting with Dr. Riddick.
Okay, so I'm from, just for context, I'm from the Army Research Laboratory, and we are the corporate research laboratory of the Army, and so we do fundamental and early applied research. So our mission objective really is to focus on the FAR term. So just for context. So for me, this multi-domain operation discussion for me began when I saw the speech that General Mark Milley made at the AUSA Eisenhower Luncheon a couple of years ago. And in that speech, General Milley talked about the near-peer adversary and what that threat means. And he talked about a near-peer battle in the future that would be very violent, much different from what we've been used to fighting, and that would require some changes. Imagining in that future battle that there may be a situation where we would not be able to have forward operating bases or FOBs because the battlefield is so lethal that you can't stay stationary for a long period of time, no traditional lines of resupply, and having to be very, very expeditionary. So when you take that along with the thinking around the technological overmatched tipping point that we're facing in near-peer adversary, and the fact that the near-peer adversaries are gaining the capability to be able to contest in multiple domains at the same time, then there is a necessity to think about multi-domain operation in a different way. And so this multi-domain operation is made up of hybrid formations that would be semi-independent and highly dispersed, able to present multiple dilemmas to the enemy at the same time, and also built around the idea of having windows of opportunity in those multi-domain scenarios in order to address the enemy. And so when I hear that, I think about the plethora of technological breakthroughs that would be necessary to or required to get to that type of fight. And you'll hear some this afternoon about the Army Futures Command and how that's being stood up around modernization priorities for the Army, which are more near and midterm. But we have to keep a focus on the far term. Losing that type of focus puts us at a potential disadvantage in the long-term fight against the enemy, particularly these near-peer adversaries.
Okay, great. Becca?
I agree. It's impossible to think about the multi-domain conversation in the absence of what we've learned about Ukraine, about activities on Fiery Cross Reef and the other features in the Pacific. But I think in a way it's also back to basics. I've studied doctrine for a long time and specialized in looking at joint air campaigns. So I think one important piece of multi-domain battle, now evolved into multi-domain operations, is acknowledging the links that we must have between air, land, sea, space, cyberspace, the undersea. It's always been a challenge within the US military to efficiently link those environments. We see that, whether that was in World War I, we're celebrating that 100th anniversary, that linkage of air and ground. We see that in World War II. We saw that in the battlefields of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. So no question, multi-domain ops is about that linkage and all the doctrine and leadership required to make it work. But moving beyond that, there's another very important element. Multi-domain operations really elevates space and cyberspace and that electromagnetic spectrum. With multi-domain ops, I see that as a recognition across US military thought that space is a vital domain, one that we must dominate and one that has an impact on all the other domains. And I see the same with cyberspace. That comes through to me in multi-domain ops, and I think that's a unique and important feature of it. But third, the question that really strikes out for me is, what does it take to win in multi-domain ops? We see a good articulation from the Army, also the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the Navy participating as well, and we see all the Joint Chiefs saying that multi-domain ops are absolutely essential. So what's it take to win? And I think we're just beginning to answer that question, but for me, that starts with the need for data fusion. We have to move to a much higher, faster, and more sophisticated level of data fusion across military operations in order to dominate and win in multi-domain ops.
Awesome. Mike?
So I'm an academic, and as an academic, I come at this from a slightly different angle. When I hear multi-domain operations, I think of it as a smart way for the Army to kickstart an important, in some ways, something that needed to happen for a long time, conversation about how to update combined arms warfare doctrine so as to compete with 21st century adversaries armed with 21st century technologies. Right? In my mind, multi-domain operation shows a lot of foresight and vision. To be sure, it seems much more like an attempt to incrementally adapt an existing warfighting paradigm than it does sort of an attempt to pioneer something revolutionary. But this strikes me as the smart way, the right way to go about working on the problem. My biggest concern actually isn't about getting the technology right or nailing the broad operational concepts. I'm confident that the Army's going to come pretty close. My worry is that the history of warfare in general, and in particular the history of wars that follow after periods of rapid technological change, that this history suggests that close may not be good enough. As the saying goes, right, close counts and horseshoes and hand grenades, and unfortunately, doctrinal learning is neither of those two. And so I think history tells us that in a competition, in a conflict between two near-peer rivals, that victory may well go to the side that learns the most efficiently, to the side that develops those fine-grained tactics, techniques, and procedures of the kind you can only start to master once the shooting actually starts. So in summary, I think multi-domain operations is important. I think that it is utterly necessary. But like many academics, I worry that it will not be sufficient. So as an academic, as a veteran, as the spouse of an active duty Army officer, I simply hope that the Army complements multi-domain operations with some serious investment in TRADOC and in its ability to rapidly learn on the battlefields of the future.
Great. Keith?
So Valerie, thank you, and thanks to Defense News for allowing me to be on this panel, which I don't know why I'm here, because you've got doctor, undoctor.
I'm an undoctor too. So
You're a
it's
doctor
okay.
too? Super. So, and usually when you're the last person that goes with a whole bunch of doctors talking about a certain subject, the only thing you can do is repeat what they've actually said. So I'm going to attack this a little bit differently. I'm going to talk to you from an operations standpoint. Yeah, multi-domain operations is just the ability of a platform or a node or an asset to go ahead and no matter where it's at, in what domain, what its roles and responsibility or functions are, is the ability to go ahead and project effects into that domain or other domains. That's multi-domain operations in a nutshell. But the important thing, and when we look at it from an industry standpoint, trying to provide capabilities, even though you don't look at it that way there, doctor, is we've got to go ahead and provide capabilities that allow unprecedented time, or really speed, unprecedented tempo, and agility. And what I mean by that is speed. That's one of the tenets of air power. Air power can be any place, anywhere in the battle space really fast. But if you look at cyber, which has been elevated, as Dr. Grant talked about, elevated to an equal level, if you will, with other domains, cyber can be instantaneous across all of the domains. So now you've got to look at how you integrate those cyber capabilities into your operations right off the bat. Right now, speed is fairly rapid. It's instantaneous associated with cyber, but the decision cycle in front of it is slow and laborious, if you will, because the second and third order consequences of a cyber effect can affect things that you didn't want to. All right, so that's really the first tenet of multi-domain operations. Second tenet, I talked about tempo, and no panel would be successful without quoting a dead Prussian military theorist, so I'm going to go ahead and do it since none of the doctors did. So Clausewitz, when he wrote On War, he talked about the culminating effect, or a culminating point. So that's where a unit or a military actually goes ahead and does offensive operations. They get to a point where their tempo cannot be sustained, their momentum, their initiative can't be sustained because of the logistics, because of resources, because of planning, because of decision cycles. So when we look at multi-domain operations, we need to provide the DoD the ability to go ahead and do tempo at an unprecedented speed. And so that we need to go ahead and utilize other domains to go ahead and actually that reach their culminating points, such as example, the air domain reaches a culminating point associated with a certain campaign. Well, we can now simultaneously or seamlessly slide in another domain to go ahead and set up for that. The third piece, when we talk about agility, and it kind of goes back to the same thing, and there's another axiom associated with planning in military operations: no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So the enemy actually has a vote here, and their behavior may not be the one we predicted. So if that happens, we need to be able to simultaneously and seamlessly utilize one domain to go ahead and satisfy the requirements of a different domain that we actually planned for that didn't come to fruition. So those three tenets, or those three pieces, are what we look at from an industry standpoint to go ahead and enable multi-domain command and control.
Awesome. Well, I think you guys all kind of laid out, why this is so important, especially in an era of, near-peer competition. So, how do we get there? What technologies are important as we look forward into this new way, I guess, of doing business, or maybe just an improved way of doing business? What sort of tech is needed? Are there different, I guess, ConOps that are needed? What do y'all think?
So I'll just jump in and start from what would now be a standard Army answer. So I mentioned a little while ago Army Futures Command and the General Milley speech from a couple of years ago. So very soon after that speech, the Chief of Staff of the Army designated 6 modernization priorities for the Army. And if you have been paying attention to what's going on with Army Futures Command, you know those modernization priorities. They are in order: long-range precision fires, next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, network C3I, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. And so these modernization priorities are the focus of Futures Command, and the Futures Command is being stood up to put the entire modernization enterprise of the Army under one 4-star command. And you'll hear some more about that this afternoon from the CG himself. I'm looking forward to that talk as well. The focus here around those modernization priorities is to deliver products through a series of cross-functional teams that will actually field technology for the soldier in the 28 to 30 time frame. But again, the role that Army Research Lab plays in this big picture is to sort of be the front end of that modernization enterprise, the science and technology piece, basic research pieces, to look and help through discovery, innovation, and transition senior leaders in the Army to imagine the battlefield of 2050.
So if I can, before we move on here, what are those technologies as you're looking forward to this, the battlefield of 2050? What do you need to enable multi-domain operations?
Obviously, autonomy will play a big role. I think the national strategy document has been mentioned in this meeting, and any strategic document that you look at now really makes it clear that as we go forward, autonomy will play a larger and larger role in the battlefield. You talk about multi-domain operation as a buzzword, but AI has become an even bigger buzzword.
Agreed.
And some worry that I have is that as it becomes more and more of a buzzword, often we don't know what the user means when he says it, or if they know exactly what. So these are particular areas where we'll see more and more growth in terms of platform, in terms of focus. But one that doesn't get a lot of mention is power and energy. And when we talk about highly dispersed and semi-independent formations that do not have access to the sort of traditional resupply, we have to think about, in this robot-intensive battlefield of the future, what that means for power and energy. And so there are research areas that we're focusing in to look for breakthroughs in power and energy that will allow semi-independent and expeditionary operation in the future in this autonomous environment.
I mean, if I could just push you one step forward, you said something very interesting just now, robots, what was it, robot-centric?
No, robot intensive.
Robot-intensive
Battlefield.
battlefield. I mean, that sounds really exciting. What does that actually look like?
Well, I mean, we think of now, we have autonomous systems, right, that operate mostly teleoperated. But the research that we're doing is to move robots from tools to teammates. And so you'll have in the future a robot that's able to actually team with a soldier, and in certain cases be the tip of the spear in such operations such as breaching operations. So imagine the robot going in front of the soldier, being the first to take shots from the enemy. So this robot as a teammate is where we want to go with the autonomy in the future.
Very cool. Does anyone else want to offer any of their thoughts about tech we might see in the future, things that are going to just be really necessary to enable multi-domain operations?
Okay, can anybody talk? Or-
Go ahead.
Even undoctors, even undoctors.
So I love the term that you just used, which was tool to teammates, right? When you talk about AI or automation. So when industry looks at automation, artificial intelligence, associated or deep machine learning, whichever term you want to use, first of all, you can define exactly what you're talking about. But what I thought was pretty interesting is we look at, and maybe the Army's doing this a little differently, but I think DoD looks at artificial intelligence as just another tool. When I look at deep machine learning and artificial intelligence, I look at a teammate. I want to be able to train, I want to be able to trust, and I want confidence associated with that artificial intelligence, that it's going to behave in a way that I predict. Just like I would train with one of my teammates if I was on a fire team, just like I'd train with one of my wingmen to, if I was on, in a force ship. I want to know what their limitations are and know what their capabilities are, and I want to be able to train with them, rehearse with them before I go into a conflict. The same thing we've got to do when we talk about AI. So it's just not purchasing an AI, an artificial intelligence, or an automation capability. It's actually purchasing a capability that you're going to go ahead and employ, whether you're training, and I love the panel we had before this, we're talking about training and virtual training capabilities. So that's the first piece I think that needs to be looked at, because you need to build that trust and confidence with that AI going forward. The other two things I think from an enabling technology we need are networking, and it's been discussed before, but it's not networking as we think about it today, it's just constant connectivity. It's the best path to go ahead and make sure you actually have the data you need, whether it's all source, whether it's open source, whether it's structured, unstructured. You need to go ahead and have that, and Rebecca hit it, I think, on the head, which was, data fusion is the key. So you need a network that can go ahead and take all the networks we have right now, so you're talking a systems level approach that can tie these disparate networks together, because you don't want to go ahead and get rid of that install base because it's too expensive to go ahead and replace. So you need to go ahead and be able to tie those together in a constant connectivity, best path to go ahead and ingest data, characterize data, and then fuse that data and do exploitation and get it to the appropriate decision maker, echelon of command in time, space, and purpose. All right, so that's the second one. And then the third piece I would say is analytics, and it goes back to data fusion. You need to be able to, on this system of system network, be able to actually have, and I'm probably stealing your thunder, sorry, sir. You need to be able to integrate predictive, big data, and effects-based analytics so that you can actually predict an outcome. And I know that, predicting the future is pretty tough, but, you need to be able to do that as a planner, a strategic planner, a theater planner, or a tactical planner. You're always trying to go ahead and predict the future. Sometimes you're good at it, sometimes you're bad at it. So again, it goes back, if you're going to do that, the analytics piece, and you're going to employ an artificial intelligence piece, you want to go ahead and train with that so that you have it across the board associated with networking, AI or autonomy, and also with analytics.
I want to go back to something that Rebecca talked about, which is space. As you guys all know, we may have a sixth military branch soon, a Space Force. Does that complicate multi-domain operations? Is this an opportunity? I would love to get some thoughts on maybe the pros and cons and how a Space Force could fit in with the other services in terms of doing multi-domain operations.
Well, let me dive in on that, if that's okay. And
Go ahead.
I think pros and cons is a great way to look at it right now. I think there's one really great thing that's come with the discussion about the Space Force is that it's stimulated us to talk about it. And there's no question in my mind that it was time for that conversation to happen. Where does the Air Force need to focus? What are the differences with air and space? So I'm all in favor of that conversation. On the pros and cons, it's a good illustration of what's important about multi-domain ops. I think back to a picture from 10 years ago. It's the KAOC. There's a tall general in a tan flight suit, and they're looking at some screens and checking in on this. And who that person is it's actually General Bob Kaler. This is 10 years ago, right? He's there from Air Force Space, and he's talking with his director of Space Forces in the KAOC about how things are going. So it's all about, from a warfighting perspective, it's about integration. And in multi-domain ops, what we see now is the recognition that space is even more important than we have thought and acknowledged. I think that's well known by those who are specialists in space within the Air Force and the others as well. I think we understand that. But here's a pure case of what we need most in multi-domain ops, and that is experimentation. We sometimes think of this great technology as being, it may be for 2030 or 2040 or 2050. Well, I think it's for next year and the year after that. We need to start to experiment with this and nowhere more than in space to see where the vital connections are for the warfighter and then what organizational structure best supports that. I could go on, but I will.
Does anybody else have any other thoughts about Space Force, or maybe even just how to better do, do space operations from, a particular services point of view, or just generally?
Could I actually jump back to your last question?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an important enabling support capability that I'm sure people are thinking about, but I haven't seen written extensively on, and I think it's extremely important both for practical and moral ethical reasons, is medicine. If you read about multi-domain operations, we're talking, BCTs out there fighting unassisted and unsupplied for up to 30 days at a time. That's going to require a fundamental rethink, not just to military medicine, but to just shock trauma medicine in general. We don't have those types of capabilities because if war looks like the way people are talking about it, we're talking Second World War, First World War, Korean War level casualties, that units are going to have to keep organically to themselves. And you think about a severely wounded soldier, are we going to put them in a coma for 30 days? Because if we can't get ammo and water in, we certainly aren't going to be able to get casualties back out again. And I think this is something that really needs to be added in an important way to the conversation, mostly because I think a lot of these innovations won't come from the military internally, but will have to come from kind of collaboration and coordination with the larger medical field.
That's really interesting. I mean, I guess that kind of poses a question in my mind. What do each of you see is the most significant challenge to enabling multi-domain operations? Is it money? Is it getting Congress to understand what this looks like? Is it actually coming up with new concepts of operations? Is it specific technology?
Well, I think because I am a technologist who focuses on far future, I would obviously say it's a technology problem. But I think that it really gets to me to the point of really helping senior leaders imagine the future battlefield. And, a point that was just made. So, the big question that's facing everyone is how do we get technology to handle the warfighter faster? And when we talk about far-term problems, those seem to be incongruent. But my organization is taking on the task of really aggressively engaging industry through a model that we started not long ago that we refer to as Open Campus. Army Research Lab now has a hub and spoke model where Army Research Lab proper is in Maryland, but we have folks down in Texas, ARL South, out in California, ARL West. And the idea that I've posed is that because transition is a part of our mission, and we have long-term objectives, we need to engage industry to come early in the discovery phase of the programs and projects that we're doing, and work side by side with us in the laboratory with academic partners to form government, academic, private partnerships. And as we work toward those long-term goals, those exceptional pieces of technology that come out of the partnership, we can quickly spin out into industry ecosystems. The industry partner can mature those, and through their process, get them into programs to the hand of the warfighter faster. Some examples, we're working right now on an engine technology that we refer to as a multi-fuel capable hybrid electric engine. This is small engine power for small UAS and small robotic systems. So you can imagine an engine that's able to run on any fuel, anywhere, anytime. The technological breakthroughs that are needed there are around fuel sensing, being able to switch parameters within the engine on demand, and also optimizing the hybrid operation for UAS. And this is one of the programs that we're engaging in our ARL Central region out of Chicago, and we have industry partners there who are engaging with our academic partners.
Mallory, could
I want to give everyone a chance to speak, but I saw Keith lean like really far forward.
I almost fell over.
Yeah, I figured with the mention of industry, you would have some thoughts there.
Yeah, so I think it's a you ask about the problems associated with it, where's the money, is it acquisition, whatever. So it's multifaceted for sure. So when you talk about technologies, as my esteemed panel member there was discussing, and I think where you guys are going is perfect. When I look at technology, I think the issue, and it's an industry and it's also an acquisition problem, and it's associated with open mission systems or open architecture systems. I discussed it has to have a system level approach, a system of systems level approach architecture. So sometimes that doesn't fit into industry's business models. It doesn't fit into the acquisition process for programs and platforms, because who goes out and buys a systems of systems level architecture? I don't know of anybody that does that right now. So that's the first piece. And then the other one is non-proprietary capabilities. And this is a very sensitive subject, I know, but it's something that needs to be addressed, because if we're going to be able to, going back to my opening comments, if your enemy has a vote in this, your adversary has a vote, so if they see we're developing something, they're going to go ahead and start developing something to counter it. So we need to have non-proprietary capabilities that bring in the best of breed immediately, but also allow us to insert new technologies into a program or an acquisition process, and also to go ahead and address emerging threats as they come through. That's tough to do if you've got a proprietary system, because it's not cost effective, and you got to let the program run its course. So that's the first piece. The second one was the doctrinal piece, and this, I'm wearing the wrong uniform to say it, but I'm going to say it anyways. There's a roles, mission, and function issue that you have to go ahead and address when you talk about cross-domain or multi-domain capabilities, because each of the services operate in a specific domain. The Air Force has, said, hey, we were in the air, space, and cyber. Now we might have a space force, which is good and also bad at times. So you've got to go ahead and get away from the parochial pieces of service stovepipe missions, roles, and functions, and realize that you're now talking about cross-domain capabilities, right? And then the last piece is the acquisition system, and it kind of goes back to my first comment associated with technology, is our acquisition process, and the industry is just as guilty as anybody else associated with this. To make money, to go ahead and have a business model that works, we need to go ahead and make sure we understand requirements, we understand the risk associated with that, and we look to government to go ahead and buy down that risk for industry as we go forward, trying to go ahead and capture business. So industry needs to step out a little bit more with experimentation and provide that to the government so that we can go ahead and still keep the competition where we need to be, but we can go ahead and accelerate the acquisition process.
Mike or Rebecca, I'm sure that you guys have a very different point of view.
To you first.
I think the thing that worries me most is that we're going to say we had a space sensor pass the target to the Navy aircraft, to the Army land-based missile, and kill the target, and slap ourselves on the back and go, we did it, we did multi-domain ops, that was it. And in fact, that's going to have barely worked, because the number one problem to me, as Keith touched on, is the communications architecture. This stuff is not there yet. I'm less worried about the platforms. We've got some magnificent platforms, F-35, others, that are coming along, but we've got to have that communications architecture. all the ability to do that is there, whether that's secure waveforms, whether it's the RF links. This can be done, but we have to take the plunge now, immediately, next year, to go out and experiment with this. In 1939, only 10% of the German army consisted of mechanized panzer corps. Only 10%. You think that the Navy invented carrier air warfare in the 1930s? No. After Midway, they had to scrap everything, and it wasn't until 1943 they brought out their Essex-class carrier with better decks, better armament, that wartime innovation. So we need that push in multi-domain ops. We can't just say, hey, we picked up this one track and handled this track, and we're good, and we got it, and let's go. And I think because we have so many good technology choices, one of the hardest things is to do the multi-domain 1.0. Take it out in the desert, put the boxes and the platforms together, try out the comm links, and see what you need to do next. That's my big concern.
Mike?
So as an academic, I'm going to argue with myself and say two things that completely contradict. I say them just as a devil's advocate. Again, I think that multi-domain operations is the right idea, the right way to start this important conversation. And I fully recognize we're at the start of the conversation, nowhere near its peak. So the first is that I think one thing we should just be aware of is the risk may not be getting the military and Congress and everybody else to embrace the future. It may be the risk that we're over-embracing the future. I remember I took my commission in 2000. It's right at the height of the Revolution of Military Affairs craze, and then third offset was just the Revolution of Military Affairs by another name. There's a tendency, especially with American strategic culture, to constantly see ourselves as kind of this period and moment of revolutionary change. And maybe we are, and we should certainly hedge our bets in that direction, but we should also recognize that history suggests that there's kind of more tradition than there is change, which is why military organizations tend to be relatively conservative. Combined arms warfare, as Stephen Biddle has told us, has kind of persisted for over a century, and there are many reasons to think that maybe we should be careful about already kind of putting some of that in the rearview mirror. And I think we should be careful not to overinflate what our adversaries are capable of doing. It seems that some of them are just now getting to the point of mastering combined arms warfare, and so we should be careful of not offsetting ourselves by overinvesting in things when those present all sorts of opportunity costs that prevent us from investing in other simpler capabilities that maybe we could use to challenge our rivals. To argue with myself, I think the other risk we should also be cognizant of, as I mentioned, I see multi-domain operations as an attempt to incrementally change combined arms warfare. Given what some of the things people have been talking and writing about, robots, space weapons, this might be a revolutionary change. In which case we need to be careful that we aren't making incremental changes in the face of this kind of massive, profound shift, which might actually render combined arms warfare irrelevant. And so we're wed to this concept and making it work with these future technologies, whereas our adversaries who never mastered these technologies can kind of just potentially skip ahead. Again, I don't want to over-threat inflate, but there is that possibility that we need to kind of get ourselves out of the combined arms doctrinal concepts and move to something that we just profoundly haven't seen yet.
It's kind of interesting because I feel like Mike part one and Rebecca kind of argued for kind of a back to basics approach where let's look at some simpler technologies or just bring it out, experiment with it, use it in a new way. And it seems like you both are making the argument that's not overcomplicate things as well.
Well,
And I think partly it's let's get going with it because, I feel in what your remarks as well, how important is that information piece and how likely are our adversaries to skip ahead? Well, the Chinese told us 15 years ago they were going to skip ahead and go straight for the information piece. And I think we see, particularly with their increasingly sophisticated electronic warfare operations, whether they were in Ukraine or all the stuff they then moved into Syria, we see Russia doing the same thing. So I think we see that the ground of challenge has shifted somewhat. I like to think that we're way ahead in that as well. But there's no question that the essence of multi-domain ops, and certainly I think from the Air Force perspective, with their interest in command and control, is to get our arms around that information and make sure we're winning in that application of information to the warfighter environment. And that's where I want to see us take the good stuff that industry already has and try it out.
yeah, and I would not downplay the moves that the Army is making in standing up Army's Futures Command. To take a 4-star command and to make the type of reorganization that hasn't happened since the early 70s, I think I would not call incremental. And in my career in the Army, I haven't seen anything similar. I think the commitment that's being made there and the environment that's being generated around prototyping, around really getting some quick wins as the command is stood up, I think will yield fruit. I think your points are very salient as far as taking the things that are in industry and trying those, so fail fast, and that's part of the mantra of the folks that are out in the front in Army Futures Command. So I think that these points and getting out there and getting it started, these points are exactly what I'm seeing from Army leadership, and I'm very encouraged as we engage this conversation that we're moving quickly towards a good solution. If I could go back to the medical issue also, just to say that there is a growing discussion around what the medical looks like in this future battlefield, right, when you're highly dispersed. And it also dovetails with some of the things that we were discussing in the back about autonomous aerial resupply. And I think folks who had a lot of heartburn about putting a person on an autonomous vehicle or an injured soldier on an autonomous vehicle and flying them back to a point of safety are having new thoughts about that. And there are technologies that are coming forward from commercial that I think are interesting. And we'll see some more in that vein.
Well, there's been a lot here so far to chew on. I would love to open it up to questions. There will be people walking around with microphones. Are there microphones?
There's a question right now.
Okay.
Yeah, you could shout.
I think there's a gentleman up here who seems really eager to ask a question.
One over there.
Oh, and this is the point where I tell you and ask you, please don't make a speech. Please just ask a question. And if you do make a speech, I may have to make fun of you in public, and we'll enjoy doing it.
All right, thank you for some provocative comments. In July of last year, the chairman introduced information as the 7th joint function. How do you see this impacting how each service employs multi-domain C2?
So I'm not sure I understood the question, but I'm not a doctor, so what was the thing you said? The 7th?
Yeah, so the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff last year made information the 7th joint function. So previously it wasn't,
Agreed.
a domain
Gotcha.
per se. How do you see that impacting command and control in multi-domain operations?
So Valerie, you mind if I take that one?
Was that directed toward any specific person, or?
Take it away.
Doctor? Which left? Your left. So,
Army and Air Force perspective.
Okay. Well, I think that when we talk about multi-domain and this idea that the near-peer adversaries will have the capability to present contested sort of environments in these multiple domains, particularly when you think about urban environments, right? We talk about urban environments sprawling, horizontally and vertically, but they also sprawl socially. And so in that environment, sort of this understanding of how to exploit that social sprawl for advantage becomes an issue. And these are tremendous sort of areas for AI and machine learning. But one thing to keep in mind, people think about AI as this commercially developed product that we'll go and buy. But in a defense environment where you are in a contested environment, you'll hear some more about this afternoon from the panelists who talk about AI. The defense problem in a contested environment is quite different because you won't have large data sets and huge computing power, and yet you'll still want to employ AI and machine learning techniques. So when I think about those types of problems, those are very defense-specific problems. And in that context, I think we're awful lucky that we have the defense labs and folks in the lab who are working specific defense problems that are in areas that folks all over are working. So there is a huge commercial investment in AI, but is there a specific investment in this type of AI where you'll have very limited data, very limited computing power, and very compressed time, and you want to employ those AI and ML techniques? That's a very specific defense problem that is different from what we'd see in other places.
I agree 100%, and I think from the point of view of my perspective of Air Force priorities, it is to get, within a couple years, to data fusion taking place at the point of the sensor, not the frustration of the great big databases that you can't completely look at or that take a lot of time. We've seen great progress there over the last decades, but we want data at the point of the sensor, and we also must have within that, whether that's across data generated from any of the information domains, we must have data authenticity. You've got to know your data is good. So those challenges are exactly, I think, the same that the Army is working on.
Awesome. Next question?
Yeah, Brock Sheets from the Association of Old Crows. As I hear about all of the, the satellite talking to the ship, to the missile, and all of those disparate pieces coming together, I see an electromagnetic spectrum noise floor that you could walk on. Do you see merit in the discussion about the electromagnetic spectrum as a domain and what that could potentially lead to?
And now that's not, oh, never easy to answer the Old Crows on that one, but it's gone back and forth, hasn't it? Is it really a domain, or is it part of the other domains? And I think wherever you want to come down on that, you can make an argument either way, but there's no question now that it is of extreme importance, and that we see our adversaries, the Chinese just set up all that electromagnetic stuff on that reef and whatnot. So, we're at the point now where we have to, multi-domain ops has to work around and surmount the challenges in the electromagnetic spectrum. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
I do. So I agree with exactly what Rebecca said, and it's not just exploiting the electromagnetic spectrum, it's access and control of it and denying that to your adversary. So it's basic EW, if you want, or electronic attack. But it goes more than that now, because the convergence of ISR functionality, the convergence of EW functionality associated with communications, and also cyber, you can get down into a single package, a multifunction kind of capability, which now you're talking about something that's gives you more swap, gives you more capabilities, and you're leveraging all the technologies, and you're leveraging the domains that you're actually operating in. So you're spot on, I think. EW, or the EMS, is going to be critical, and access to that and control of it is the key. I don't know if it's going to be another domain, but I treat it as a domain from an L3T perspective.
Anyone else got a question? Back there?
I think this is on. Rachel Cohen with Inside Defense. So this is specifically for Dr. Riddick. I'm curious how much involvement the Army Research Lab has had in the TRADOC and ACC multi-domain war games, and what you've learned out of those, and if there are any kind of joint development opportunities that you see specifically because of those war games.
Particularly with regard to Unified Quest, this last activity that was held, we played a significant role in providing underpinning S&T subject matter expertise there. We have a growing relationship with our colleagues at ARCIC, one that we see in the future strengthening as we move into the Futures Command environment. So traditionally, we have helped to provide S&T insight to the TRADOC wargaming exercises, particularly Unified Quest.
Okay, anybody got one question back there? Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike Bruce from C4S ARNet. I was wondering if any of the panelists could discuss about, in the next budget cycle, what you'd like to see to know that there is a real commitment to multi-domain operations, and I guess to see that there's a further commitment to multi-domain.
No one want to talk about the budget?
Well, it's probably unfair for industry to say, because I want more money, of course. But I think the commitment that I would like to see that, is, and we're already doing this, and you've heard it from the panels before us, is the jointness associated with this. This is a joint problem. It's a coalition problem. It's a partnership problem. So there's got to be either language that talks about, hey, you need to go ahead and address this from a joint, and I hate to use the word joint program officer, or joint effort, because those are always fraught with issues associated with it. That's why I said the roles and functions and mission was something we've still got to go ahead and talk about when you talk about multi-domain operations. The last piece of that, I would guess, is, and I just see that there's 15 seconds left, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my answer from there.
Dr.
So,
Reddick?
I would say that I think if you've paid attention to the POM process that we've undergone, particularly in S&T in the Army, you've seen large movements of money. Those are, public. I don't think there's any need to go into too much detail. But I think having done that, I think we're aligned very well, again, around those areas that we want to emphasize, autonomy being one, and then the modernization priorities in general. The process that we've gone through in approaching standing up the Futures Command has been one where the S&T budget has been scrutinized very closely by the leaders of the cross-functional teams, and I'm, satisfied from my perspective that we're making the proper types of investments and, to get after the near and midterm problems, but to also keep the balance on the far term. I think there was some mention about adversaries jumping ahead, and that is something that, as the lab, the Corporate Research Laboratory of the Army that's focused on discovery, innovation, and transition, that those far term, those out there problems, we're the guardian of those pieces and able to keep the leadership focus on that balance.
I would like to see a well-funded specific line for advanced capability technology demonstrations, because that is in part how we built out the great battlefield networks of Afghanistan and Iraq 10 years ago. I'd like to see that funded now for the 1.0 multi-domain ops battlefield networks.
Anyone, Mike, do you want a final word?
Nothing
or-
to add.
So I stopped 15 seconds before the end, and everybody kept talking, so I feel like I got to say something now. So.
Okay.
So the other thing I'd like to see is what Rebecca saw is a line item associated with data fusion. And again, it goes back to a systems level approach. So if we're serious about this, and we're serious about going ahead and affecting situation awareness, decision making, force direction, and battle management, we need to go ahead and look at fusing data. And that means a data fusion comms hub, or it means an architecture that's going to be able to fuse that no matter the source, the structure, or the format of that data. So that's the piece we need to go ahead and look at.
I hate to cut the conversation off here. We're running a little bit over. Thank you so much to the panelists. You guys, gave us so much to think about. Could I get a round of applause for them?
Thank you. Thank you. Nice job.